Why medicine? Why the fascination? And when did you become interested in medicine?
I decided when I was 8 years old that I wanted to be a missionary doctor. Used to hear the stories in church and Sabbath school about missionary doctors traveling all over the world, great personal sacrifice to bring not only physical but mental and spiritual healing to people, and they seem like the most noble people on the earth. So I decided that I was going to be a missionary doctor when I was 8 years old. And that was my dream until I was 13, at which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out, and psychiatrist was in. I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on TV they seemed like rich people. They drove Jaguars, they lived in these big fancy mansions. They had these plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. So I said, this is great. This is what I'm going to do. But I was the local shrink in high school. Everybody brought me their problems. I would rub my chin, say, tell me about your mama. And then I did psych as a psych major in college, advanced psych in medical school. But I came to the understanding that my real talent had to do with eye-hand coordination, the ability to think in 3 dimensions. I was a very careful person, never knocked things over and said, oops. It's a good characteristic for a brain surgeon, by the way. And, I put all that together. That's how I came up with neurosurgery. And then with kids, with kids, what you see is what you get. They don't put on a lot of airs. They don't have a lot of secondary agendas. And you can operate for 10, 15, 18 hours on a kid. And if you're successful, the reward may be 50, 60, 70 years of life. Whereas with an old geezer, you spend all that time operating, and they die in 5 years of something else. So I'd like to get a big return on my investment. But and frankly, on a serious note, spending my whole professional career trying to save children and to provide them with longevity and quality of life is really the main reason that I'm doing this. Because when I think about their future, and I think about what we're doing to their future financially and in lots of other ways, and maybe the traditional politicians will fix it, but I don't see any evidence of that looking over the last few decades, and therefore I just can't sit idly by and watch it happen.
It's hard to characterize the main reason you're doing this, but focusing on what you believe needs to happen for the children of America, what are the top 2 or 3 issues that you want to address immediately, the most important things facing the country?
Well, I want to get our fiscal house in order. Thomas Jefferson said it's immoral to pass debt to the next generation. If we could somehow transport him to our time right now, he would probably immediately stroke out if he saw what we were doing. $18+ trillion of national debt. If you tried to pay that back at a rate of $10 million a day, 365 days a year, it would take you more than 5,000 years. And this is what we're passing on to our children. But that's the good news, because it's the fiscal gap that concerns me. And anybody who's not familiar with the fiscal gap, when you go home tonight, please look it up. This is essential that we all know about this. That's the unfunded liabilities that we owe as a government. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, governmental programs, all that we owe going forward versus what we expect to collect from taxes and other revenue sources. And those 2 numbers should be pretty close together if you're fiscally responsible. If you're not, a gap develops there. Bring it up into today's dollars and you got the fiscal gap, which sits at over $200 trillion. And the only reason we can sustain debt of that level is because we can print money. We're the reserve currency of the world. If we could not print money, Greece would look wonderful compared to where we would be. And we have to find a way to get that under control. It must become a priority for us.
We've heard for years it's unsustainable, and yet it has been sustained. Is it unsustainable now?
Well, it's sustainable until the house of cards collapses, and then it's not sustainable.
What collapses the house of cards?
Well, you can only tolerate so much debt. And what if we can't print money and we still have that level of debt? Now, we are the reserve currency, but that's a title that generally goes with the number one economy in the world, which we have been since the 1870s until last year when China took over. Would they like to be the reserve currency? Would they like to be able to print money? Yeah, it would help them quite a bit with the situation they're in. But their system won't sustain it right now, fortunately for us, so we still get to be. But to me, it's just a warning. It's a blessing that we have this warning and we have this time that if we act intelligently, we can fix it.
Tell us about acting intelligently. What would you do to fix it?
Well, thank you for asking that question. First of all, we need to balance the budget. It's ridiculous what we're doing. And if we simply refuse to increase the federal budget by 1 penny for 3 or 4 years, that would balance the budget. I would do a lot more than that, quite frankly. I would call in all departmental heads and I say, I want you to reduce your budget by 3 to 4%. And if you can't do it, turn in your resignation now, because you're going to be fired. Anybody who tells you that there's not 3 or 4% of fat in all of our departments is lying through their teeth.
Give us an example of the fat. Say in defense,
okay.
say in healthcare.
I'll give you an example. The federal government owns 900,000 buildings. We also own 2.4 billion acres and all the mineral rights. But let's just stick with the buildings for now. 77,000 of those buildings are either not utilized or severely underutilized. And yet, with taxpayer money, we are leasing or renting 500 million square feet of office space. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So, I mean, there's plenty of fat that can be cut. That's one thing. The other thing is, we have to understand that from 1850 into 2000, our average growth rate for our economy was 3.3%. From 2001 to 2014 is a 1.8%. That's a marked change. If you extrapolate that out over 20 years, at 1.8%, you're talking about a $26 trillion economy. At 3.3, you're talking about a $35 trillion economy. That's a big difference when you've got all these unfunded mandates, unfunded liabilities to deal with. So you have to ask the question, how do we get that economy rolling again? Well, we have the most powerful economic engine the world has ever known. But what have we done? We have put all these fetters of regulations around it. And what people don't realize is that every single federal regulation, in addition to complicating people's lives, costs money. And that money gets passed on. I remember, when Dodd-Frank came along, I've been in corporate America for a long time. A lot of people don't know that. I sat on the board of Kellogg for 18 years, Costco for 16 years. I was the chairman of the board of Vaccinogen, a biotech company, in addition to starting with my wife a national scholarship fund. So plenty of business experience. People think I don't have it, blow them away in business. But anyway, what we have to recognize is, during all that, we would sit around the table talking about who do we have to hire in order to deal with this regulation and this regulation and this regulation, and we would have to hire them. Guess who gets to pay those costs? The consumer. So that's my point. Every regulation costs in terms of goods and services. Who gets disproportionately hit by that? Poor people and the middle class. It doesn't bother the upper class, but it hits those people disproportionately. Those are the kinds of things that are driving these income gaps that you never hear the Bernie Sanders or the Hillary Clintons talking about. And so we need to get the unnecessary regulations out, not the necessary ones. Our founders said if men were angels, no government or regulation would be necessary. But we know men are not angels, nor are women. Therefore, we clearly do have to have appropriate regulations in place. That's one thing. The other thing is we have an unreasonable taxation system. We need a system that encourages entrepreneurial risk-taking and capital investment, not one that depresses it. And just one last thing, in terms of the taxes, the corporate tax. We have the highest corporate tax in the developed world. And it is driving business out of our country. That's a no-brainer. And what I would suggest that we do is have a 6-month hiatus on the corporate taxes so that we could repatriate over $2 trillion of American money overseas. And that wouldn't cost the taxpayers 1 penny, and 10% of it, I think, should be utilized to create jobs for people on welfare and people who are unemployed.
Dr. Carson, there are many people, and certainly the Democratic presidential contenders, who believe that American corporations in many instances are not paying enough, not paying, quote, their fair share. What do you say to that?
You might be shocked to hear that to some degree I agree, in the sense that we have all these loopholes and deductions and things that allow people to escape paying. I know a lot of people who make a lot more money than I do and pay considerably less taxes than I do because they have very slick corporate lawyers and they know how to, manipulate the system. I don't manipulate the system, so I pay through the nose. And I don't like paying through the nose. I don't think anybody likes paying through the nose, but I think it should be fair across the board. And that's why I have advocated, a flat tax. The reason I like that idea is because it's based on proportionality. And I make no secret of the fact that I think God's a pretty fair person, and he advocated a tithing system. He didn't say if your crops fail, you don't owe me any tithe. He didn't say if you have a bumper crop, you owe me triple tithe. So there must be something inherently fair about proportionality. You make $10 billion, you pay $1 billion. You make $10, you pay $1. And you get the same rights and privileges. And you get rid of all the deductions and all the loopholes so that nobody gets any special favor. And of course you have your people who say, but that's not fair, because the guy who put in $1 billion, he's still got $9 billion left. That's not fair. Well, that's called socialism. And that's not what built America. What built America was people said, that guy just put in $1 billion. Let's make the environment even better so next year he can make $20 billion and put in $2 billion. That's what built America. It was never built on taking and dividing and redistributing. That's not America.
If we went to the flat tax, what has your analysis told you about what that would do for revenue for the country?
Well, the key is you have to get rid of all the deductions.
You can't have a flat tax and the loopholes and deductions.
Right, you got to get rid of all of them. And, a lot of people say, but I'll lose my house if I don't have a mortgage deduction. But they're not thinking, because the fact of the matter is your tax rate is so much lower, you don't need that mortgage deduction. And a lot of people say, well, churches will all disappear and all charitable organizations will disappear. They need to go back and read their history book, and you will see that charities thrived very well before 1913 when we enacted the federal income tax. And I think if people have more money in their pocket, they'll actually be more charitable, but they'll be able to give it to the people that they want to give it to. I think it's going to have to be somewhere between 10 and 15, probably closer to 15 in the beginning, but as we get things going, it will gradually come down.
Do you really believe charities won't suffer if there are no deductions for charitable donations?
I don't think so at all. Think about America. Think about the country that we live in, which you might be surprised to know we were the impetus for socialism. The Europeans, they looked over here. They saw the Fords and the Kellogg's and the Carnegies and Mellons and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers, and they said, you can't have a society like that where you have these rich people and then everybody's poor. You got to have a government that receives all the funding and then equitably redistributes it. Have you ever heard that before? So that's how socialism got started. But what they didn't know is that we were different. All those names I just gave you, instead of just hoarding money and passing it down from generation to generation, built the infrastructure of our country, built the transcontinental railroad, built the ports and the textile mills and the factories, which allowed us to create the most dynamic middle class the world has ever seen, which rapidly propelled us to the pinnacle of the world. As late as 2009, 40 of the wealthiest families in America agreed to give away half of their wealth to charity. Go to Africa or Asia or Europe or South America, ask the 40 wealthiest families to give away half their wealth. They'll look at you like you got 6 heads. This is an American phenomenon. When there's a disaster in the world, who's always right out front? We are. We're generous people. And we have to take advantage of that, because I can tell you, traveling around this country, speaking at a lot of events, I've seen enormous success when people invest in their fellow human beings and personal relationships are developed and people are willing to put tons of money into it. And I've seen the results of that. And I have a very good inkling of what could happen in this country if the government can just act to help coordinate and facilitate the goodwill of the people, because I really believe it is our responsibility as the people to take care of those in our society. It is not the government's job.
Dr. Carson, from the audience, a common GOP theme is the need to make America great again, but America is the greatest country in history. What is not great about America?
Well, what's not great about us right now is that we've allowed the purveyors of hatred and division to have too much sway. And hence, they've convinced people that there's a war on women, that there's race wars anytime there's conflict between people of two races, that there's income wars, that there's age wars, that there's religious wars. And, I don't believe it for one bit. But they've had too much sway, too much influence. And we, the American people, have got to understand that we are not each other's enemies. The enemies are those who are trying to convince us that we're each other's enemies. Because you disagree with someone on some issue, that doesn't make them your enemy. It doesn't mean that you want to destroy their lives and get rid of their employment and sue them. I mean, this is crazy.
Isn't the Republican Party and Republican leadership just as guilty in that regard as the Democratic Party?
Well, I got to tell you something. I'm not a highly partisan person. I think it is a huge problem. I don't care which party you're in. And the reason that it's so important that we stop fighting each other is because we have much bigger problems. And they're not Democrat problems or Republican problems. They are American problems. And when our financial structure collapses, if we continue down this road, it's going to affect everybody. I don't care what your party is. And if we keep fighting each other, we are, and we weaken ourselves, when the jihadists get over here, I guarantee you, they're not going to ask you if you're a Democrat or a Republican before they cut your head off.
Let's talk about, from the audience again, money in politics. How would you prepare to get the influence of money out of politics? It's a great bumper sticker. Is that ever really going to happen?
Well, I'll tell you how I'm personally doing it. I'm not going around looking for billionaires and licking their boots and asking them for
You have a very
contributions.
unusual way of fundraising.
I have no intention of ever doing that. I'm not going to get into bed with special interest groups. I think that's abominable. I simply said, if the people want me to do this, then the people need to fund it. And they have been funding it at record level. And we have no problem whatsoever in doing what we need to do without licking the boots and without bringing in special interest groups. And in a Carson administration, I got to tell you, the special interest groups are going to be out in the cold. We're just not going to deal with it.
Yeah, for those, and we'll move on to, there's a whole, obviously, range of issues we need to get to, but for those who don't know, Dr. Carson, by design, presumably, has fundraised in a very unique way in this campaign. Tell this audience what is different about the way you've approached it. You touched on it a little bit.
Well, basically, we've gone to the people. We have, we're approaching 3 million Facebook friends, and they donate. We have over 400,000 donations, and the average donation is only, around $50. Some of the letters are so poignant. People on fixed incomes, and they say, I can only afford to send $25 this month. But they say, next month, I'm going to send you $25 again. And the next month, I'm going to send you $25 again. And I got to tell you, I do not want to disappoint those people. I certainly don't want to waste their money.
We'll move off the money equation here for in a moment, but can you compete that way through the long term? You're up against, at least in the Republican side, Donald Trump, who has all the money in the world, and of course, after the nomination process, things will change financially, but can you compete for the moment?
Well, all I can tell you is throughout my professional career, I encountered people who said, you can't do this. No one's ever done this before. That can't be done. And if I listened to those people, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. So, I'm not worried about that, to be honest with you. And this is not to say that we're not talking to some big money people, because we are. But we're making it very clear to them that they're welcome to donate, but they're not buying any influence. They can donate if they are on board with our attempt to save America in the way that we are planning to do it.
All right. Let's move into some of the major issues in this campaign. As a physician, you are uniquely qualified to talk about this in some respects. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, what's wrong with it? What would you do differently? Very specific.
What's wrong with it? My God. Okay.
Was there a problem? Let me start this way. Was there a problem before Obamacare?
Yes, there was a problem before Obamacare. No question about it. And, I was involved in trying to fix the system even before Obamacare, but working within the system. I don't think it's doable within the system because it was such a bad system.
And very quickly, because I want to walk through this with you so people really understand. What was wrong with the system in your estimation? You saw it day to day.
Yeah, well, the biggest problem with the system is that we had a major pillar of it being insurance companies that made a profit by denying people care. It was an inherent conflict of interest. Plus, it was a big, unwieldy system that was incredibly inefficient. I shouldn't use the word was, it still is. But the thing about Obamacare that I really dislike is not that it doesn't work and not that it isn't affordable. What I really dislike about it is this is a country that was supposed to be of, for, and by the people, with a government there to facilitate life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With Obamacare, along comes the government and says, we don't care what you, the people, think. This is what we're doing. We're going to shove it down your throats, and if you don't like it, too bad. Well, that's a completely different paradigm than what America was supposed to be. And what I have proposed instead is a health savings account system. Make health savings account available from the day you're born to the day you die, at which time you can pass it on. And I'm talking about the kind of health savings account that works like your savings account. You have control of it. There's not 600 bureaucrats in it. And you pay for it with the same dollars that we pay for traditional health care with. You wouldn't have to use as many of them. And you give people the ability to shift money in their health savings account between members of the family. So if you were $500 short, your wife could give it to you out of hers, or your uncle, your cousin, your brother, your sister. It gives you enormous flexibility.
Cover deductibles and that sort of
anything in the medical field.
But it would be up to me to save that money in that account.
Well, the money in the account, like I said, would come from the same sources that the money comes from now. It's just that instead of it going to buy a health insurance policy, it goes into the accounts and it's divvied up that way. it makes the cost of your catastrophic insurance dramatically lower because nothing's coming out of it except catastrophic health care. How often do you have that? It's like a homeowner's policy with a large deductible. It's a very different animal than a homeowner's policy where you want every scratch covered. And that's going to take care of 75% of the population quite easily. It doesn't take care of the indigent. Now, how do you take care of them? It's unfortunately, about a quarter of our population, about 80 million people, which is far too many, which we can fix if we fix the economy and we get the jobs available for people. But that's another story. Let's deal with what we have. We have 80 million people. We take care of them now with Medicaid. The Medicaid budget is $400 to $500 billion a year. That's a lot of money. If you divide 80 million into 400 billion, that's $5,000 for each man, woman, and child. That's the allocation. What could you buy with that? A concierge practice. Concierge practice is $2,000 to $3,000 a year on average, and still have a couple $1,000s left over to buy your catastrophic insurance, which is much cheaper now. I'm not saying we should do that. I'm saying that's how much money there is. And look what could happen with that. If we begin to let indigent people have their own health savings account, a lot of people in Washington, D.C. say it won't work because they're too stupid and they can't manage something like that. But they said that about food stamps, too. And they did learn how to manage it. And they would learn very quickly not to go to the emergency room when they has a diabetic foot ulcer and pay 5 times more than it would cost to go to the clinic. They'll go to the clinic and they'll take care of it also, but they'll say, now let's get your diabetes under control so you're not back here in 3 weeks with another problem. A whole nother level of saving that we are not realizing right now. So that's the way you get the prices down and empower people, because now people are starting to think about their own health care. They're taking personal responsibility. We want programs that encourage responsibility, not programs that encourage dependency.
And that is the fundamental flaw in your judgment of Obamacare.
That's one of the biggest flaws. The flaw is that the most important thing that we have, our health and our health care, is being put in the hands of the government. That's not America.
You are listening to the Commonwealth Club of California program. Our guest is Republican presidential candidate Dr. Ben Carson. I'm Dan Ashley of ABC 7 News in San Francisco, your moderator. You can hear Commonwealth Club programs on radio. Catch up with us on the club's YouTube channel as well. Dr. Carson, while we're talking about health care and health-related matters, let's talk about, this is from a member of the audience, your comments in the past about Margaret Spanger of Planned Parenthood. Walk us through, do you regret anything you've said on that topic? Have you changed your mind at all?
No. What I've said about her is easily findable on lots of different places. She was a eugenicist. She made her feelings known about who she considered to be inferior, and she thought that it would improve the society by keeping those people from reproducing and by having the ones that she considered superior to reproduce. I find her to be a despicable person.
And let's talk about Planned Parenthood and the controversy over abortion. You have said you are pro-life, but you want decision made within 20 weeks. Is that correct?
No, that is not correct at all.
Okay, tell me where you are. Forgive me.
I am pro-life.
Period.
Having spent my entire professional career trying to save lives, working all night, many a night, on a premature baby to save their life, operating on babies still in the mother's womb, I think it's pretty easy to understand why I would be pro-life, why I would not sanction killing babies at any level.
And yet you have made a distinction between using material from an unborn child for research purposes versus what Planned Parenthood is talking about. Draw the distinction for people.
The distinction is quite easy. It's sort of like if you're on an archaeological dig and you find a tablet that has some writing on it, but you don't recognize that writing, and you turn it over to your archivist, and they go through all their archives, and they say, this looks like something from Mesopotamia, in the 5th century. And that's how you kind of figure out what the
What that is.
relationship is. We do the same thing in medicine. They have tissue blocks of every aspect of humanity, from a fertilized egg to people who are 120 years old. And they go back and they look at those tissue blocks and samples to help determine. So what I did in that research was provide the tissue, because nobody else has a way of getting into the middle of the brain and getting that. I gave them the tissue. They take the tissue, they compare it, and they were able to, figure out what were the origins of that tissue.
From the audience, as president, what would your position be on full-service reproductive health centers, including abortion?
I do not believe in abortion on demand. I simply don't, so I wouldn't fund it. And I know there are a lot of other people who don't believe in it, and they shouldn't be forced to fund something like that. If people, I'm a live and let live person in the sense that, I'm not going to put you in jail if you don't agree with me. But the interesting thing about America, if you look at the whole abortion issue, you'll see how the opinions have migrated significantly over the last couple of decades. Why? Because now we have ultrasound, and we have endoscopy. We have ways of seeing that baby. You can see that baby at 12 weeks. You can see the little nose and the little eyes and the little fingers and the heartbeat. It's real hard to say that that's not a human being. It's hard to say that that's a meaningless clump of cells. And as people begin to understand this more and more, they will not be very comfortable with the idea of sticking something in there and, ripping its head off and pulling its arms and legs off. That's just, it's the only way you can do that is if you can somehow in your mind convince yourself that that's not a human being.
As president, would you push hard to remove abortion rights, to change the Supreme Court ruling?
I would certainly be looking to appoint people who respected human life, who respected the culture of life rather than the culture of death, because I believe that this is a country that was founded on morals and values. And I believe that America is different. I know there are those who want to fundamentally change us and make us like everybody else, but we're not like everybody else. We're America. There is such a thing as an American way. There's no French way. There's no Canadian way. There's no Portuguese way. There's an American way. You can be un-American, but you can't be un-Nigerian. You can't be un-Swedish. There is something that is very unique about this country. And we rose to the pinnacle faster than anybody else, and we rose to a higher pinnacle than anybody else. And it's because of the way we thought and did things. And it was because of the values that we had. And right now we find ourselves in a situation where we are busily giving away all the values and principles that made us great so we can be politically correct. And I think that's a big mistake.
The qualities and characteristics of America that you just outlined in broad brush are why so many people want to come here. Let's talk about illegal immigration. We have 13 million, roughly, people here illegally. Huge debate in this campaign, huge debate across the country, certainly here in California, about what should be done. Donald Trump has said, well, throw them all out. What say you?
Well, first of all, I say you can't even begin this debate without securing the borders. And we have the ability to do that. We have the ability to do it. We just don't have the will to do it. I was down on the border with my wife a few weeks ago, and I was just shocked. There was nobody guarding it. The fence that was there, it was the kind of fence we used to go over with no problem when I was a kid. I mean, there's nothing to it. There was one area where they had cut a big hole in it, and they repaired it by putting some barbed wire across there. The cameramen who were with us, they wanted to film us from the Mexican side, so they just went right through that. And they were not athletic people, and they had all their equipment. So, I mean, it's ridiculous. It's just an open funnel. So you got to seal that, and we can do that. And then what you have to do is you have to turn off the spigot that dispenses the goodies, including employment. If there's nothing to come for, then people won't come. That'll stop the influx. Okay, now, you still have to deal with the people who are here already. And, you know, it sounds really cool, you know. Let's just round them all up and send them back. People who say that have no idea what that would entail in terms of our legal system, the cost. Forget about it. And plus, where are you going to send them? So, you know, that's just a double whammy. What I have suggested is that we allow people to become guest workers, assuming that they don't have any criminal record or anything. If there's anything askew, they go. But they have a 6-month window, and they can get registered. They can pay a back tax penalty. They can pay their taxes going forward, and they now exist above ground. Now, why is that an important thing to do? I was talking to a farmer in South Dakota recently. He has an 8,000-acre farm. He starts workers out at $11 an hour. He said he could not hire a single American, not one. And, you know, and I've encountered many others who've said the same thing. That farming industry would collapse. Now, there are those who say, yeah, but, you know, we need to have high wages. They have no idea what that's going to do to their food prices. And they're being very naive when they say that. But it's also the hotel industry. There's a lot of industries. So if they're hard-working people who've been here working hard, and they want to continue working hard, and they have a clean record, and they're contributing, I don't feel that it's practical to try to round them all up and throw them out. Now, it doesn't give them
because it's expensive and impractical to do so, and because of the effect it will have on removing those workers who will work at those wages.
You got to look at factor A and factor B, and you got to be pragmatic. You know, you can't do everything based on emotion.
Does it perpetuate that group as an underclass if you keep them here working at low wages?
I don't feel that would be an underclass, because they still, if they want to become American citizens, can apply for American citizenship, but they have to go to the back of the line and have to go through the same process as everybody else does. They don't get special treatment just because they've been here. And I think that's fair.
We can keep them out. Would you build a wall like some candidates, namely Donald Trump, has talked about? Or would you just add, what would it take to increase protection on the border?
A wall alone is not good enough. You have to have that wall monitored. There have to be people there. And when we were down in Arizona, there were people, but they were like 75 miles inland. At the wall itself, there was nobody. And I was talking to the sheriffs down there. They're so frustrated because they catch people, you know, they put them in jail, and then they get these things from ICE that says, let them go. And they're dealing with the same people a few weeks later. And there was one guy that said they deported him 20 times. He came back 20 times. You know, and there's no consequences to them. There's no help from the federal government. The federal government is doing nothing to solve this problem. That's why we need a different federal government.
You mentioned people making $11 an hour working on farms. Where do you stand on raising the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage? What should it be, and how should it adjust?
Well, you know, I think the appropriate thing to do is to actually have a national conference on the minimum wage. And let everybody put their rationale for it, and let's look at it objectively. And let's decide what it should be, and it probably have to be changed or prorated for each state based on what the cost of living is there. But let's index it then to something so that we never have to have this discussion again in the history of America.
Race relations, making a lot of news, particularly with what has been happening with confrontations between people of color and police officers around the country. Hard to say whether they've increased or we're just seeing more of those incidents. Your take as an African American and as a political candidate and as a physician and as an American, where is America in terms of race? Is it as bad as we perceive it to be, or not so much?
Well, as a nation, we've made enormous progress with race relationships. And, a lot of people don't want to acknowledge that, but, having grown up in Detroit, which was a very segregated city with a lot of racism, and, those who've seen the movie saw the depiction when I was in the 8th grade, and I was the only black student and got the highest academic award, and one of the teachers got up and chastised the white kids. How could you let a black kid be number one? That's the environment I grew up in. I grew up in an environment when I went to Hopkins as an intern. I'd go on the wards. Invariably, a nurse thought that I was an orderly. Mr. Jones isn't ready to be taken to the OR yet. I would say, well, gee, I'm sorry he's not ready. I'm Dr. Carson. And they turn 18 shades of red. And I would be very nice to them. And I had a friend for life. But, I realized that from their perspective, the only black man they'd ever seen on the wards in a scrubs was an orderly. So why would they think something different? And what happens is so often, we get into this mindset where we let people, rev us up and create, hatred over just a misunderstanding. And I think that's something that can be resolved to a large extent from good leadership. And the other thing, think about this logically. Are there rotten police that do bad things? Absolutely. Are there rotten news people who do bad things?
No,
absolutely.
heavens no.
Rotten doctors, rotten teachers? Yes, of course. Do we go out and try to kill all the other ones because of that? Of course not. That is just a silly way of doing things. And we really, once again, need to sit down, people on both sides, with their grievances, with their solutions, because we're smart people. And we can come up with solutions if we don't get in our respective corners and throw hand grenades at each other.
And that, that sounds great in theory, but in practice, how does that translate out on the street where there's great animosity?
In practice, how it translates onto the street is we start taking police officers and putting them in communities. And you introduce them early and regularly so that little Johnny's first encounter with a police officer is a pleasant one. Somebody playing catch with him, guy that he knows all the time. I was talking to a police officer in Baltimore recently. He says he spends a lot of time in a particular neighborhood that he patrols. He says he never has to buy lunch. He never has to buy dinner. People always say, hey, Joe, come on in. That's how you solve that problem. It's relationships. When people know each other, it's a completely different situation.
How do you, from race relations to political relations, we were promised, the country was assured that when President Obama ran for office 8 years ago, that the acrimony would diminish in Washington and that we would work together. Politicians have said this as long as I've been covering news for 30 years. What makes you believe you can change that dynamic in Washington? Because people in many parts of the country have sort of checked out. They don't believe politicians anymore.
Well,
Why should they believe you?
I would simply say that I hope over the course of time people will come to understand who I am, will go back and look at my history, and on the basis of that will know that I'm not just blowing smoke, and that I have no great ambition, quite frankly, to do this. But I feel called to do it by a lot of my fellow Americans. And the doors are opening, and I will do it. And I think as a nation, we are incredibly talented people. One of the things that I've discovered, through my decades of work in corporate America, and establishing a scholarship program in all 50 states, as well as through my medical career, is the level of talent that we have in this country. I've also gotten to know a lot of military people and people in the government. We have really smart people. And if we utilize them together, what we can accomplish is mind-boggling. And what we've done instead is we've divided ourselves up into Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals, and we let that dictate who we are, rather than thinking about what actually makes sense. And again, we perhaps have not had real leadership. We certainly, have not had it in recent past. Not just this president. The previous president was, I think, so involved with the war and the war effort. He didn't want to cross anybody because he needed everybody to agree to fund what he was doing. And quite frankly, the administration before that, it goes back a while.
This is not new.
It goes back a while. It's not new.
Well, let's quickly, before we run out of time, jump overseas and talk about foreign policy. Was the deal with Iran's nuclear program a mistake? What would you, and if so, what would you do differently?
Yeah, it was a big mistake. And first of all, I don't agree that it was a deal, because I think it should have been a treaty, and I think that Congress should have insisted that it was a treaty. There were multiple nations involved. It met all the criteria for a treaty. And if it was a treaty, then it would have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate, which it never would have gotten. So that's what they should have insisted. But, they let them snicker them. But at any rate, it's an executive deal, which means it has no standing with the next administration. None. Zero.
And if you're the next administration, what does that mean?
It means it will have no standing.
And you'd go back to square one and redo that agreement.
I would go back to square one, and but I would know how to negotiate. You can't have a negotiation that doesn't involve, accountability and verification and enforcement. That's negotiation 101. We don't have that. Maybe I could get Donald Trump to help with the negotiation, but
he's done that in various walks of life. What do you perceive to be the major issues? We've talked about Iran, the major issues facing us overseas. China, ISIS, global fight against terrorism?
There are so many, but
prioritize.
In terms of what can result in our destruction fairly quickly, I think global jihadism. A lot of people say, let's not get too involved over there, because in 2003, we went and we invaded Iraq. It cost us a lot of money. It cost us a lot of lives. What did we get for it? We can't do that again. I do understand that, okay? But that's not really analyzing the problem, because this is a completely different situation. We now have global jihadists who are an existential threat to us. They want to destroy us and our way of life. And if we don't understand that, we're playing directly into their hands. And we have two choices. We can sit around and act like they're not that important. They're the JV. We can drop a few bombs in the desert and say we're doing something. Or we can use every resource available to us. Financial resources, military resources, overt and covert resources, to destroy them first.
Full-scale war against them is what you're describing.
I'm saying we need to do what we need to do in order to prevent them from destroying us. Their goal is to destroy us. And we have to be mature enough to recognize that we can't just sit there and let them do it.
Where would you fault this administration in terms of how they have handled that threat as an example of what we should do going forward? Have they failed?
I think they've sort of handled that threat the same way they handled the threat of illegal immigration. They don't do anything. They just let it happen. And they're not really doing much to thwart the goals of the jihadists who have, established their caliphate. They've got half of Iraq, a third of Syria. They have a foothold in Tunisia and Nigeria. I mean, they're expanding. They're looking like winners. And that's why they're being successful in their recruitment efforts. Therefore, we need to be thinking about what can we do to take them out of the winner's circle.
Very quickly before we run out of time, China and the huge trade imbalance with China, how would you deal with that?
Well, first of all, you need to recognize that, the Chinese have been around for a long time. They're very pragmatic people. Honestly, when you look back historically, they're pretty reasonable people, but they also recognize weakness when they see it. And when they see it, they take advantage of it. And that's why, the adventurism in the South China Sea, that's why they feel that they can attack us in cyberspace. That's why they feel that they can manipulate their currency and not pay any consequences for it. I think when they encounter a strong counterforce, you're not going to see them doing all of those kinds of things.